Just like that, a church service turns into a crime scene. The sanctuary, once filled with hymns and hallelujahs, erupts into chaos. Screams pierce the air. Congregants scramble for safety. At the altar, Pastor Jeremiah Atkins stumbles back, his pristine white shirt now marked with blooming red. His body crumples to the ground. And then, her scream. Isabella Atkins. It's a sound that cuts deeper than the gunfire itself, a raw, anguished cry that echoes beyond the church walls. The sirens wail in the distance, growing louder. But in that instant, one question looms over the congregation, heavy as smoke. How did it come to this? Welcome to Vic's Veil of Justice, where we peel back the layers of truth lurking beneath the headlines. This story isn't just about a scandal. It's about faith, betrayal, and the lengths some will go when their hearts are shattered. So buckle up. This one will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust. And hey, before you start yelling at your screen in disbelief, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. It's scientifically proven that true crime lovers subscribe 73% faster after a dramatic plot twist. Now, let's step behind the veil. It began like any other Sunday morning at Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church, a place that stood as a symbol of hope for Atlanta's South Side. The stained glass windows bathed the congregation in a kaleidoscope of color as the morning sun poured in. The choir's voices soared, filling the sanctuary with a melody so harmonious it felt like heaven itself was leaning in to listen. Families packed the pews, dressed in their Sunday best, their hearts open and ready to receive the word. At the center of it all stood Pastor Jeremiah Atkins. He wasn't just a preacher. He was the preacher, the kind of leader who didn't just speak to you but seemed to see you. His voice, rich and commanding, carried a message of redemption and grace that could move even the most hardened skeptic. To his congregation, he wasn't just a pastor, he was a beacon. A man who had pulled himself from the wreckage of a troubled youth and risen to become a pillar of faith. With his Bible in one hand and a kind smile that felt like a warm embrace, he shook hands with his flock, calling many by name. There was something magnetic about him. He had that rare ability to make you believe that you mattered in a world that often overlooked people like them. But here's the thing about light, it casts shadows. And Jeremiah's shadow was growing darker by the day. Because while the congregation saw their shepherd, the man who had led them through hardships and heartbreaks, Jeremiah knew that behind his polished sermons and his warm, reassuring smile was a ticking time bomb. And the worst part? The countdown had already begun. The doors slammed open, the sound like a thunderclap cutting through the hymn that hung in the air. Heads whipped around, gasps rippling through the pews as every eye turned to the source of the commotion. There she was, Sheila Johnson. She stood framed in the doorway, her chest heaving, her eyes ablaze with a fury that seemed too large for her small frame. Her trembling hand clutched a gun, the metal catching the light as if it, too, demanded attention. The congregation froze. Some clutched their Bibles tighter, others instinctively shielded their children. But the sanctuary fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by Sheila's ragged breathing. "Jeremiah," she spat, her voice trembling but fierce. "You can't ignore us anymore." The air seemed to vibrate with the weight of her words. And then, before anyone could process what was happening, before anyone could move to stop her, 3 deafening shots rang out. The sound echoed off the walls, dissonant and jarring against the holy space. Jeremiah stumbled backward. His hand clutched at his chest as red bloomed against the white of his shirt. The congregation screamed. Chaos erupted. Some ran for the doors, tripping over one another in their desperate rush to escape. Others were too stunned to move, rooted to their pews as the scene unfolded before them. And there, at the center of it all, Jeremiah collapsed onto the altar steps, the place where he had once stood tall and commanding, now drenched in his blood. But here's the thing, this wasn't random. It wasn't senseless violence. Sheila's fury wasn't faceless. Her rage wasn't aimless. This wasn't the act of a stranger or a random attack on a man of God. Sheila Johnson had a reason. She had a name. And behind that trembling hand and that loaded gun was a heartbreaking ultimatum that had been years in the making. So let me ask you this. What would drive someone to walk into a church, into a house of worship, with a gun in hand? Because for Sheila Johnson, this wasn't just a moment. It was the end of a long, bitter road, and the beginning of a storm that would shatter everything Jeremiah Atkins had so carefully built. Jeremiah Atkins wasn't born into the pulpit. His beginnings were a far cry from the polished sermons and tailored suits that would later define him. He grew up on the unforgiving streets of South Atlanta, a place where opportunity was scarce and survival meant learning how to navigate danger. Jeremiah had a natural charm, the kind that could talk him out of trouble as easily as it could pull him into it. He wasn't a bad kid, but he had a knack for finding himself in the wrong places, with the wrong people. As a teenager, he ran with a rough crowd, boys who saw life as a game of risks and rewards, with no second chances. Jeremiah liked the thrill, the sense of invincibility that came with their late-night escapades. But invincibility, as it often does, proved to be an illusion. One summer evening, that illusion shattered. Jeremiah was hanging out on the corner with his best friend Marcus, a brother in all but blood, when the sound of screeching tires cut through their laughter. The next thing he knew, gunshots rang out. The world slowed as he hit the pavement, his heart pounding in his chest. When the smoke cleared, Marcus lay bleeding beside him, his lifeblood staining the cracked asphalt. Jeremiah cradled his best friend in his arms, his mind racing as Marcus gasped for air. There was nothing he could do. No words, no promises, no bravado could save him. That night, something inside Jeremiah broke. But in that brokenness, something else began to stir, a quiet, unexplainable pull that led him, for the first time in years, back to the steps of a church. And there she was, Mama Hester. Mama Hester was the kind of woman who could look straight through you. She was a fixture in the community, a pillar of the local church, and a grandmother with a stern gaze that could command silence in a room full of rowdy boys. Jeremiah had heard her words 100 times before, always brushing them off as old-time religion. But this time, they landed differently. "The Lord's got plans for you, boy," she said, fixing him with a look that brooked no argument. "You just got to open your eyes and see it." For the first time, Jeremiah didn't roll his eyes. He didn't scoff or walk away. Instead, he sat in the back pew of that little church, tears streaming down his face as the pastor spoke of redemption and second chances. And from that moment, Jeremiah was a man on fire. He threw himself into the church with the same intensity he'd once reserved for the streets. He studied the Bible relentlessly, memorizing passages with the fervor of someone trying to save his own soul. His charisma, the same gift that had once helped him sweet-talk his way out of trouble, found a new purpose. People were drawn to him, captivated by his story of transformation. It didn't take long for him to rise. Youth leader, guest preacher, ordained minister. By the time he was 30, Jeremiah Atkins wasn't just a pastor. He was the founder of Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church. The church began modestly, with services held in a rented storefront. But Jeremiah's message, his fiery sermons about second chances and his ability to connect Scripture to the struggles of everyday life, resonated deeply in a community desperate for hope. People came in droves, their faith rekindled by the man who had turned his life around. Jeremiah Atkins became a symbol, a shining example of redemption. But redemption, like light, casts shadows. Behind the pulpit, Jeremiah carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. The congregation saw a man of faith, but not everyone bought into the image. Not everyone saw the pastor as a saint. And then came Sheila Johnson. Their paths crossed at a community center. Jeremiah, in the early days of his ministry, had been volunteering to mentor at-risk youth. Sheila wasn't there to be mentored. She stormed into the center like a whirlwind, ready to confront whoever had wasted her time. Sheila was fire, fierce, unpredictable, and unapologetic. And Jeremiah? He was captivated. Their story started with a spark, an attraction that defied logic. But, spoiler alert, it didn't end with a happily ever after. Sheila Johnson wasn't just a footnote in Jeremiah's story. She was the storm waiting on the horizon, and she was about to shatter the carefully constructed world he'd built. Sheila Johnson was everything Jeremiah Atkins wasn't supposed to want. She was fierce, unpredictable, and unapologetically herself. From the moment she stormed into the community center, demanding answers and turning heads, Jeremiah felt a pull that defied reason, faith, and his carefully cultivated image. Their first interaction was electric. Sheila's sharp words met Jeremiah's calm, measured responses, creating a tension neither of them could ignore. She challenged him in ways no one else dared to, pushing him out of his comfort zone, making him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. For all her fire, there was a vulnerability beneath her tough exterior, a rawness that Jeremiah found impossible to resist. Their relationship began in secret, each meeting a stolen moment away from prying eyes. It was intoxicating, thrilling, an affair that burned hot and fast, igniting passions they couldn't control. But passion is a dangerous flame, and soon it threatened to consume them both. When Sheila told Jeremiah she was pregnant, everything changed. Jeremiah froze, the words hitting him like a blow to the chest. A baby, his baby. This wasn't part of the plan. His entire life, his ministry, his reputation, his carefully crafted image, depended on order, on control. A child born from an affair with Sheila, a woman who represented everything chaotic and unpredictable, threatened to unravel it all. In the quiet of his apartment, Jeremiah paced back and forth, his thoughts racing. How could he reconcile his public persona with the reality of what was happening behind closed doors? How could he face his congregation, his community, with this truth hanging over him? The answer came to him, though it was anything but noble. He couldn't. Jeremiah made a decision that night, one that would haunt him for years to come. He would support Sheila and the baby financially, but he would keep them hidden from the world. His public life and his private shame would remain separate, two worlds that could never be allowed to collide. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, least of all Sheila. As her pregnancy progressed, The weight of Jeremiah's decision began to crush them both. Sheila, once fiery and full of life, grew bitter. She resented being kept in the shadows, relegated to a hidden corner of Jeremiah's life. And Jeremiah? He felt the walls of his secret closing in, the pressure mounting with every passing day. The birth of their daughter, Zoe, should have been a moment of joy, a chance for Jeremiah to embrace the family he had created. But instead, it became another secret, another lie he had to carry. Each time he held Zoe, her tiny fingers gripping his, he felt the sting of guilt. He was a father who couldn't claim his child, a man of God who had chosen deception over truth. And so, the years passed. Sheila and Zoe became ghosts in Jeremiah's life, always present, always just out of reach. He visited them in secret, bringing gifts and money, but never the acknowledgement Sheila craved. Each meeting was fraught with tension, every interaction a reminder of the life he had denied them. Jeremiah believed he could keep the two halves of his world separate. But secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply they're buried. And Sheila? She wasn't the type to stay hidden forever. By the way, if you're sitting there wondering what happens next, and I know you are, why not hit that subscribe button? It's like saying, yes, I enjoy gripping stories, shocking twists, and occasionally yelling at my screen. Plus, subscribing is free, unlike Jeremiah's hush money fund. So, go ahead, click it. You know you want to. Isabella Atkins was the kind of woman who seemed to float through life with an air of grace. She was a devoted wife, a pillar of support to her husband, and a beloved figure in the church community. Whether she was planning outreach events or coordinating choir rehearsals, Isabella's presence brought a quiet warmth to everything she touched. To the congregation, she and Jeremiah were the perfect team, a shining example of faith and partnership. But perfection is often an illusion. While Isabella poured her heart into the church and her marriage, Jeremiah carried a secret that threatened to unravel it all. At home, the cracks in Jeremiah's facade began to show. There were moments when his usually confident demeanor gave way to unease, a lingering glance out the window, a distracted tone during dinner. Isabella noticed these shifts, but she told herself it was the weight of leadership, the pressure of shepherding such a large congregation. She prayed for him, never imagining the truth that lay beneath his restless behavior. And then came the phone call. Late one evening, as Isabella tidied the kitchen, she heard Jeremiah's voice drifting from his study. Low, tense, desperate. She paused, her hand tightening around the dish towel. Jeremiah wasn't one for secrecy, but this was different. "Please, Sheila," he said, his voice cracking under the strain. "You have to give me more time." "I can't," he stopped, his words heavy with fear. "I can't let this come out. Not now." Isabella's heart stopped. The name alone, Sheila, was unfamiliar, a stranger's name on her husband's lips. But it wasn't just the name. It was the way he said it, the way his words begged and pleaded, filled with a desperation she had never heard before. She pressed herself against the doorframe, her breath catching in her throat. Every instinct told her to turn away, to pretend she hadn't heard, to protect the fragile world she had built around her marriage. But something deeper, something sharper, held her in place. Jeremiah's voice continued, each word like a dagger. "I'm doing everything I can. Just don't do anything rash. Please." The pieces began to fall into place. though Isabella wished with every fiber of her being that they wouldn't. She didn't need to hear Sheila's voice on the other end of the line to understand. The truth came crashing down with brutal clarity. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her heart, her faith, her future, had betrayed her. Isabella stood frozen, her mind reeling. How long? How deep did the betrayal go? And how had she missed the signs? The perfect life she thought she had built with Jeremiah was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Would you stay? Or would you walk away? That's the question Isabella now faced. But in that moment, as the weight of her husband's deception pressed down on her, she didn't have the answer. All she had was the shattering realization that the man she thought she knew had been living a life she could never have imagined. Sheila Johnson was unraveling. In the dim light of her small apartment, she paced the room like a storm brewing, her muttered words barely audible over the sound of her own heavy breathing. The years had worn her down, piece by piece, stripping away the fire that once defined her and leaving only the raw edges of hurt and bitterness. For so long, she had watched from the shadows, unseen and unacknowledged. Jeremiah's life, a life of respect, admiration, and unwavering devotion from his congregation, was one she felt should have been hers. He had taken her love, her loyalty, and their daughter, Zoe, and locked them away in the dark corners of his double life. Sheila wasn't just angry, she felt erased. She opened the drawer where she kept the gun. Her hands trembled as she stared at it, the cold metal reflecting the flickering light of the lamp. This wasn't who she wanted to be. But the weight of years of secrecy, broken promises, and rejection pressed against her like a vice. Her eyes flicked to the small table in the corner where Zoe sat coloring, her quiet innocence a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her mother. Sheila felt tears sting her eyes. Zoe didn't deserve this. She deserved more, a father who didn't treat her like a secret, a life that wasn't lived in the shadows. "Baby," Sheila said softly, her voice breaking as she knelt beside her daughter. "We're gonna go see Daddy today." Zoe looked up, her small face filled with a mixture of confusion and excitement. "Really, Mama?" "Really," Sheila whispered, though her voice carried no joy. She reached for the gun and tucked it into her purse. The weight of it felt heavier than she expected, as if it carried not just steel and bullets but all the pain and desperation she had bottled up for years. Sheila stood, glancing at herself in the cracked mirror by the door. Her reflection stared back, haunted, broken, and determined. This wasn't about revenge, she told herself. It was about justice. About making Jeremiah see what he had done, what he had taken from her, from Zoe, from their lives. Her pain had turned to desperation. And that desperation had become a plan. It wasn't a good plan. It wasn't even a rational one. But to Sheila, it was the only plan left. And as she took Zoe's hand and stepped out into the evening light, Sheila knew one thing for certain. By the end of the day, Jeremiah would no longer be able to erase her. What she didn't realize was how much that plan would cost. Not just Jeremiah, but everyone whose lives were bound to his. The sanctuary of Graceful Redemption Pentecostal Church now stood eerily silent, its once vibrant energy replaced by a chilling emptiness. Police tape crisscrossed the doors, fluttering in the faint breeze, a stark reminder of the chaos that had unfolded within. The stained glass windows, once a symbol of hope and light, now seemed to cast shadows that stretched longer than before. The congregation, fractured and shaken, grappled with the unthinkable. How could the man they trusted with their faith, the man who preached redemption and second chances, have harbored such secrets? Could they ever look at their sanctuary the same way? And Sheila, was she the villain of this story? Or was she a victim of years of broken promises and unfulfilled hope, driven to the edge by desperation? For Isabella, the questions ran even deeper. She walked away from the courthouse holding Zoe's small hand in hers, their steps slow and measured. The child, innocent and oblivious to the magnitude of what had happened, clung to her, seeking the safety of her presence. In the quiet moments that followed, one thing became painfully clear. Trust, once shattered, is rarely restored the same way. But amidst the wreckage of betrayal, some found resilience they never knew they had. For Isabella, Zoe, and even Sheila, the days ahead would not be easy. They carried scars, both visible and unseen. Yet in those scars lay a story of survival, a story of finding strength not in perfection, but in enduring the worst and still moving forward. So, I ask you, do you believe in redemption after betrayal? Or are some wounds too deep to heal? Because in the end, one thing is certain: when the truth is laid bare, it changes everything. And sometimes, from the ruins of what was, something new can begin to grow. So, what do you think? Was Sheila a victim of broken promises and rejection, or a villain who let her pain spiral out of control? Did Jeremiah's fall from grace deserve redemption, or were his secrets too damaging to forgive? Justice or punishment? Truth or betrayal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear how you see it. And if you're craving more untold stories from behind the veil, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Just a fair warning: you may never look at Sunday service the same way again. This is Vic's Veil of Justice, where we pull back the curtain on the stories you thought you knew. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, truth has a way of finding its light.